It's just coming up to 5 past. If I give some other people maybe 2 minutes, and then we'll see if anybody else comes, and then we'll start. Is that okay? Thanks.
She's missed her flight. Oh no, yes, she missed her connection, so she probably won't make it.
It's just me. Of course, don't worry, I'm going to start quickly. I'm just going to start quickly. Thank you for coming. Small audience, but elite audience. At least you'll be able to go and tell people what you heard this afternoon, and they will be envious, I'm sure. We've got Dr. Martin Moore with us, and we have Deepa Iyer. I'll let them introduce themselves as I continue. The question that we're discussing is exposing commercial interference in press freedom, and it's as soon as you begin to talk about commercial interference, you're probably initially discussing an economic model of how the way media or press has operated for the last 50 or 100 years. And whenever we ask that question about commercial influence, we tend to be really asking one simple question, and that is, how is it possible for news content to be paid for? My background as a journalist is with The Independent and the BBC, and then recently Open Democracy. When I was at The Independent, we began to look at, there was one story in particular about a cabinet minister who'd been involved in kind of sexual adventures. It was not important to us what the behaviour was. The important thing was the rest of Fleet Street seemed to know about it and didn't want to publish the story, simply because that particular individual was involved in press regulation. So the story was buried, and then we published later. And then I joined Open Democracy, and Open Democracy is a strange organization in the sense that it funds long-term investigation, which is very rare in Fleet Street at the moment. Reporters cost money, reporters using up a lot of time cost money, and that model isn't necessarily there anymore. So commercial interference is something that we decided we would look at in a European-wide survey. And if I quickly go over, we sent the survey to 47 odd nations, and we got responses back from a couple of hundred journalists, and even that was quite hard. And the responses we got were 2/3 of the respondents felt as if there had been an increase in the influence of PR. Quite spectacular. And were told, basically instructed not to criticize any company or person that had commercial or investment ties to their company. 1 in 3 said their news outlet was less critical of commercial partners, and 1 in 3 said that a line editor had altered the focus or the tone of stories. Now, for anybody who's worked in the media, it might be something you've experienced all the time. 2/3 of respondents, I said, felt as if this PR or advertising influence was there and was obvious, and half said that reporters in their newsroom had been offered money or other benefits by companies or third parties simply to cover a story. Now, whether that's a small number of disgruntled reporters, it doesn't really make that much difference. What it means is that because the model is broken, there's a new form of commercial influence on the outcome of what you see and what you read. At Open Democracy, one of the things that we tried to keep in mind was that if that link between what you read and what you believe, namely something that we may call trust, is broken, then the whole model is broken, and it might not be a fixable model if trust is gone. But my experience was to look at one particular story, which was the Evening Standard, and how they had used, if you like, sponsored content in a very strange manner. We got presentations that they had given to a number of companies, and the number of companies were effectively for a £500,000 buy-in, where it basically promised money can't buy news and positive comment. That means for a £3 million project, the Standard was effectively dividing the difference between church and state, or rather blurring the difference between church and state. It involved Google, funnily enough, and it involved Uber. Now, this was slightly strange, as the Google digital initiative, they're spending 150 million euros on making sure that you know the difference between real and fake news, whilst paying £500,000 to ensure that a London monopoly paper is delivering exactly what they're supposed to be fighting against. And they'd done it before with a company called Syngenta, one of the big agri-commercial companies. So it's the Evening Standard, of course, deny that this is what they were doing. But as I said, we had the presentation and we had the digital presentation that they were given to companies. And one of the companies that may be familiar to you, called Starbucks, said, no, thank you, and described what was being presented to them as PR death. So some companies, some media outlets know the difference between, if you like, commercial interference, and some are only too willing to adapt to it. Open Democracy published the resignation letter of a very prominent political commentator in England called Peter Oborne at the Telegraph, basically saying that one of the commercial clients of the Telegraph was so big that they were not prepared to allow anybody to criticise them. So Oborne basically blew the whistle on them and left the Telegraph. And apparently this morning, I hadn't seen this, but this morning, I think an online news site called Business Insider published a story that's saying they were accepting money from Facebook to make sure that there were a lengthy diet of stories about how positive Facebook were to try and dampen down the criticism they have. Now, I don't know the full story here, and I don't know if it's absolutely clear and crystal clear that this is sponsored content and that the reader knows it, but it just shows you the extent of this blurring of state and church division, and how commercial interference in press freedom it's not necessarily a new phenomenon in the sense that there's always been very rich proprietors, but we don't know the full extent, and I don't know how many people in this room have experience of, or either in a newsroom feeling that commercial pressure is out there. Can I ask if anybody's ever felt that? One in the middle. Anybody ever read something that they've thought that this was more than just news, but a positive message was being given to you in a commercial entity? Exactly. And again, not particularly new, but maybe something that the media themselves should be aware of, because I think once trust is gone, then whether it's newspapers or the internet or anything, that will change. So enough of me talking. I'm going to introduce Martin Moore. Now, Martin is the director for the Centre of the Study of Media, Communications and Power, and senior lecturer in political communication and education at King's College. He's the author of a number of books, one of them being Digital Dominance, the Power of Google, Amazon and Facebook. And his latest book is called Democracy Hacked, How Technology is Destabilizing Global Politics. Now, the book is, this, and you'll forgive me if I'm paraphrasing, it said, in the space of one election cycle, authoritarian governments, moneyed elites and hackers figured out how to game elections, bypass the democratic process, and basically turn social networks into battlefields. Now, he is basically, one of the summaries of the book is prepare for a new strain of democracy. So Martin is going to be talking about his book when I bring him in, and the other person alongside me is Deepa Iyer. Now, she works with Luminate, who's one of people who've actually funded Open Democracy's work. Now, she's in this interesting position of being in investments and can talk about, if you like, the philanthropic add into the model. So if the model has changed and we're looking at commercial influence, we're also looking at news organizations maybe willing to listen to offers or seeking offers from philanthropic organizations. So we've got three sides of this. This is myself as a journalist complaining about commercial interference, Martin pointing out that this is going to happen because the model and the technology have changed, and Deepa seems to be sitting in the middle of it, probably having to listen to news organizations, both digital and whatever media, looking for new sources of funding. Now, my first question would be to her, if you're an organization and you're seeking to deliver money to somebody, how do I know that you've done enough to make sure that this is a neutral donation and doesn't come with strings?
Definitely. I'm happy to maybe just start by providing some context on Luminate and what we do. So Luminate is a philanthropic investment fund. We were formerly called a Media Network for the past 10 years. We were the governance and citizen engagement team there and spun out late last year. Luminate focuses on issues that are relevant to democracies across several countries, 18 different countries in Africa, LATAM, South Asia, Southeast Asia. The independent media team at Luminate specifically does a range of different types of investments. So we do for-profit equity investments into innovative business models in media. Some of our portfolio companies include Rappler in the Philippines, The Ken in India, Scroll in India, a range of other companies globally. We also give grants to nonprofit investigative journalism that's holding power to account. So examples of our grantees there include ICIJ, Amabungane in South Africa, Forbidden Stories based in Paris. And last but not least, we do a range of work around building the media ecosystem globally. And so, for example, we're an LP in the Media Development Investment Fund. We also are looking at different innovative financing mechanisms to bring more liquidity to media markets globally. So in relation to your question specifically on how does an organization know whether our funding comes with no strings attached, I think we're actually a very unique funder in this space because we provide core organizational support and we are not involved at all in editorial decisions. And I think that this is quite rare amongst philanthropic funders in media specifically. So we would not fund, for example, a portion of a media organization's work focused on a philanthropic priority. So for example, I know of large philanthropic funders that fund in relation to other parts of their work to specifically sponsor content. We don't do that. We provide core investment support, and that's very clear in all of the conversations that we have that we try to be as unconditional as possible in our funding because we know that that's a critical need in the market space for financing.
Can I bring up one point? I mean, philanthropic content or add into, say, a newspaper like The Guardian is a very, very small part of what they do, and they always maintain that if it's money from Rockefeller or if it's money from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that it's badged in such a way that the reader knows. And The Guardian also maintain that they take money from these organizations simply because the expense of doing that kind of detailed either environment work or health work and sending reporters all over the world is simply not a financial resource available to most news organizations now. But The Guardian, I'm skeptical, but I'm desperate to keep trust in that funding. Is there anything that comes with a Luminate donation? Do you insist on monitoring or knowing what they do, or are you involved in any way?
Definitely. I think we try to be as supportive as possible to our investees. I think I like to frame it that we try to make it to be as much of a pull model as possible as opposed to a push model of our support. And so we do sort of offer, a range of different ways of engaging with our portfolio. We're conducting a review of our entire portfolio currently and just asking everyone, in the portfolio, hey, what are the top 3 things keeping you up at night, to basically try to identify, okay, what are the needs within this portfolio around issues of cybersecurity, issues of restricted funding and fundraising, issues of organizational structure and human capital. And so I think we definitely see the ways in which we can support our portfolio or engage with them more from a holistic organizational health perspective and less from, a perspective of like what is our influence and power and how can we wield it, or at least that's how, I would frame it.
Okay. There'll be plenty of time for people in the audience to ask questions as soon as we're done. And I think even I have questions on that I'll maybe ask later. Can I bring in Martin at this point? I suppose one of the things that basically brought us to look at exposure and commercial influence was that over the last 8 to 10 years, it's estimated that roughly £1 billion has been lost in revenue, has disappeared from the UK print industry. the picture is probably not that different right across Europe. And advertising is still in there. Newspapers have found themselves having internet footprints in the way that maybe even 20 years ago they didn't. I mean, one example would be British newspapers used to be almost, if you wanted to buy a house in the UK, you would buy a newspaper and there would be page after page after page of adverts for houses, and that was, in the Guardian, sometimes that would be Guardian property, which brought in the Guardian, a large amount of money. It's interesting that the new websites that sell houses in London are now worth more than the total communications industry in the UK. So places like Zoopla and all these, they make a fortune. And what it means is the media organizations that knew that this new technology was going to arrive didn't spot the potential and lost that market. And maybe, Martin, if I ask you, in terms of advertising technology, in terms of what's out there and what is changing, how much of a change are we looking at in terms of the technology? Because you've just written recently on this.
So I suppose, one of the reasons for this conversation is because we all know that news journalism is struggling to fund itself. It is becoming more and more difficult to maintain certain types of journalism, local journalism being the most obvious, but also what the Americans call beat journalism, various other types of journalism across many democracies. And the traditional model for an awful lot of news media has been advertising, as Jim says. I suppose the big message that I would have from what I've looked at is that some news organizations are looking to digital advertising as to take over from the old model of analog advertising. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's a really serious mistake. And I think it's a mistake not just because I don't think news organizations can play that game, and I'll explain why, but also because I've come to the conclusion that actually digital advertising, which is incredibly different from advertising in the analog world, it works in a fantastically different way, is antithetical to public interest journalism and the types of journalism that I was just talking about. And I'll just really quickly just give a couple of reasons why I've come to that conclusion. The first is because digital advertising is done at a scale and in a way that is unprecedented. So it is, it's dominated, as we know now, by Google and Facebook, digital advertising, who take up the majority of the market and 90+% of the growth in the market. It is designed from its outset as an open, automated system, a DIY system. So it's built on the idea of producing your own ads and then sending them through a system which is almost entirely automated. So in many respects, it is there's no oversight in the sense of there's certainly no human oversight about which ad goes where. And I don't know if anyone was there at a session we did this morning, but does anyone know about real-time ad exchanges? No reason why you shouldn't in the room necessarily. Real-time ad exchanges, where if you go to a website and the various boxes around the site, around the article that you're reading, aren't filled the second you go to the page, but they fill up very quickly after you've been to the page. The reason for that is not because it's taking a while to download them. The reason is because the moment you went to that page, your details, or everything that's known about you from your digital footprint, is thrown onto an ad exchange, a real-time digital ad exchange. And then buyers, ad buyers, will bid if they want to get your attention. And the highest bidder for your attention will get that space. Now, the implications of that for news are that it doesn't matter what you're looking at. It doesn't matter what the content is like in terms of quality, in terms of any aspect of the content. What matters is the person you're reaching. So who cares if they're advertising to you at a fringe site, or if they're advertising to you at a kind of quality high-end site? In fact, actually, and this is something that I discovered because a couple of months back, I spent a morning with a digital ad company. I just asked them to walk me through.
This is how exciting Martin's life is. He spent a morning doing this.
And they walked me through a Facebook ad campaign. They walked me through one of their Google ad campaigns. And on the Google ad campaign, they were going through the various tools in the back end of the Google ad campaign. And there's a toggle on these on Google, which is just like, you know, switch you push across, which says minimize cost per click, and you turn it on. Now it's incredibly. Why wouldn't you want to minimize cost per click? What that means is you're trying to reduce the amount of money you spend per the people that you get to respond to the ad. But you know, it seems a really straightforward decision. Well, of course I want to reduce the amount that I spend. What it means in practice is that Google is systematically redirecting money that would have gone to the more authoritative, higher cost ad sites to the lower cost, fringe, sometimes extreme sites. So structurally, it is sending money away from the more authoritative information to the less authoritative information. The other reason why I think that this is antithetical to the future of news and news organizations is because it relies on unbelievably intrusive tracking. And this has become more and more the case, particularly in the last 5 years. So the way in which the ads are sold to advertisers is we can reach the person you need to reach at the right moment, in the right place, when they're in the right mood, when they're going to click on this particular ad. But to do that, they need to collect an amazing amount of information about all of us, all of the time. So back in 2012, Google merged about 30 different personal databases so that it can have as much profile information on individuals as possible. Facebook, as we know, already knows an awful lot, but then they started merging from third parties as well. So essentially, they are in this arms race of gathering information about end users so that they can fulfill the promise to the corporate advertisers. So to cut to the chase, I mean, as I say, news organizations, we've got news organizations trying to get into networks so that they can bind themselves together so they can charge more for the advertising within those networks. Most of that, as far as I can see, is not working at the moment. We have, news organizations trying to, in some ways, copycat some of the tech platforms, in the sense that I don't know who has a browser called Ghostery. You know what is Ghostery? It's a great browser. I would encourage you to download it. It tracks trackers. So it tells you who is tracking you on any website at any particular time. And most news organizations are tracking us. And most news organizations are not just one or two trackers. If you go to even the high-end sites, last time I went to the New York Times, it had over 24 trackers on the New York Times website tracking my movements around the site.
You mentioned in your book, you say, we're in this new potential strain of democracy where, an amazing sentence, where switching your mobile platform will have more impact on your life than switching your government. I mean, is that what you're...
Well, no, I mean, so that's just, well, I can come to that. That's a separate point, but I mean, I think what I'm just getting at here is that once you start playing in this digital ad game, then you're playing in a really, really messy, very, so everyone knows the journalist Craig Silverman, who he's the one who first exposed the fake news industry in Veles in Macedonia, Northern Macedonia. And he has done a lot of work around digital advertising, and he refers to it now as a dumpster fire because it is such a mess. It is so full of fraud, so full of trackers, so full of last year alone, it was estimated there was $19 billion worth of fraud in digital advertising. So it's a game that I don't think these organizations should be playing. But of course, it raises the question that if you don't go down the road of digital advertising, then what do you do? How on earth do you fund a news business? Because the model, the analog model that worked for 150 odd years, doesn't work anymore, and it's not going to translate into the digital environment. So it makes even more relevant this whole question as to how on earth you fund yourself.
It's a very painful picture, which is if we stop excuse me for this, if we stop talking now, and I ask anybody, I've got a couple of questions, but has there anybody got an immediate question about anything that's been said so far? Hands, this gentleman here. Is it? He's got a microphone.
Sorry, I didn't get the date of your survey regarding the...
It's about a year old. It was published about a year ago. It was over, it took us about a year sending it out to, as I said, about 10,000 journalists all over the place in Europe, and then waiting on the survey coming back. So it was published about a year ago in detail.
And what were the proportions again? Because I didn't get it from your...
It's in the actual, if you look it up, it'll be there. We got something like, it was sent out we got in the region of about 700 or 800 responses. Mm-hmm. So it's, statistically, you would think if I've sent out that amount of questionnaire and we get these results back, you would have to have a reasonably high sample size to make it legit. What we found is that we sent out a survey, a questionnaire, and we asked people if they would wish to identify themselves or not, or to tick some boxes to say that this was a problem. We found that even in the UK, we found that very, very few journalists wish to identify themselves, and only wish to identify a minor problem. So we could either say there is a problem out there and then quantify that, and we were also hoping that maybe in the survey there would be examples of influence coming back to us, and very, very few, a handful of journalists came back with specific examples, naming a certain newspaper, naming a certain commercial influence, which basically, I suppose that anybody's ever worked in a newsroom, especially if you're maybe a young journalist, you're certainly not going to fill in a form, identify your own newspaper on the idea that maybe this could be traced back to you. So we phoned people who we knew had taken part of the survey, and we said, it was anonymized, why do you think that journalists would not wish to point out that they were in another era? Now, in my own experience at the Independent, for instance, we had one fairly experienced journalist who had been approached direct by the advertising department rather than his news editor, was specifically asked to do a series of articles which were effectively sponsored content and would be labelled as such. And he said, look, this would damage my reputation, I would rather not do it. And it took a month of negotiation to get the advertising department to back off. Now, that's an experienced journalist. We were dealing with some websites and some news organisation in Europe where the staff was largely under 30 and, maybe holding a job that was difficult. If you lose that job, maybe you're not going to get another one. So the survey we were surprised at how reticent people were. Maybe we shouldn't have been in retrospect. Maybe we should have expected that this is not an industry that's happy with itself simply because there's a shrinking funding. And if you've got a job as a journalist and it pays and it helps your livelihood, maybe you're not going to answer too many questions. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
But as I said, if you are, I don't know who you are, but if you are a statistician, then I fully accept that this is maybe not the most robust thing you've ever come across. But it was the best that we could do given the responses that we had.
What is the final percentage that you said at the beginning? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
I'll give you the details at the very end, okay, rather than take up. Anybody else? A quiet audience, willing to listen. The gentleman at the back, please.
Speaking of commercial interference, what do you think of the fact that Facebook and Google are the main sponsors of this festival?
Martin.
I think it goes broader than that. I didn't realize before I came that they were, but I think it goes broader than that. I don't know how many people in this room work at news organizations, but how many news organizations now take some funding from Google or Facebook?
Can I imagine? Imagine you are a news organisation, or you're an academic organisation or a think tank, and Google are coming to you, giving you the money that you particularly want to do to hold something like this. It's almost difficult to refuse. In fact, it's difficult to refuse for even, there's a few small investigative journalism websites and organisations in the UK that are part of that Google initiative to try and combat fake news or whatever the actual object of that is. I find it very difficult to imagine that Google are doing that with an underhanded message. I think they're trying to do it because they genuinely know that this is something that they should be doing. But at the same time, power is a funny thing, especially monopoly power. Monopoly power is something that you, if you're in the United States, you hold on to. So at the same time, they may be doing two things that are contradictory. So if I gave them the benefit of the doubt at the moment by saying that they're funding this or helping to fund this organization in which we're discussing the problems of Google, it's a bit like a government that knows it's in trouble, but is nevertheless continuing to analyze what the problem is whilst not sweeping it under the carpet. So they're, you know, I don't know if that's...
Yeah, I mean, I think also, you know, several global news entities rely on Facebook and Google for dissemination, either through their hardware or through, you know, their platform in some sense. And so while, you know, while one would, you know, love to take a moral high ground, I think it's also difficult to do given how deeply embedded those platforms are with the industry.
Can I ask one question? Is there anybody here who's had a Google-free week in the last couple of years where you haven't used it? Anybody? I can't remember. I can't remember why I haven't done that. So we may be using a tool which we can make as much. It's a bit like Starbucks. I find it very difficult to walk back past Starbucks sometimes, but at the same time, I know they're a monopoly organisation and then sometimes they behave badly. Any more questions? This gentleman at the front, please. Oh, sorry.
I'm getting it instead.
Okay, that's fine.
Hi, I'm Linda Thompson. I'm a Belgian freelance journalist. I think that as a freelancer, this discussion is particularly relevant because I would say that as a freelance journalist, it is impossible for me not to do some commercial work. If I did only journalism stories, particularly because the issues I care about are not the ones that necessarily do well with mainstream legacy organizations, I need to do some commercial writing. And where I draw the line is I don't do copywriting. For instance, let's say I write a lot about corporate tax. That would be one of the better paid subjects I write about. I would never then do copywriting for a legal, like a law firm, let's say. Do you find that you've done any research around how freelancers should handle this new reality?
I think a freelancer's existence is pretty tough in this. I mean, we're talking about commercial interference. Well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with commercial journalism at all. In fact, I work with photographers who do news work. You know, we've travelled to South Sudan together. You know, we've covered stories, and the photographer is not being paid as much as he should be or she should be, and that most photographers do a bit of commercial work and they do a bit of other work, and it's not really an issue. What we're really discussing here is not whether commercial influence is a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, there's nothing particularly new about billionaires owning newspapers. They've done that for 100 years. They've used newspapers as an instrument of power. What we're talking about is the ability of the reader to know when an advert is there and when an advert is not there. I mean, if I had a PowerPoint, I could stick up some old-fashioned Coca-Cola adverts or Lucasade adverts or adverts for anything, and you would recognize it immediately as an advert. What my concern is that you don't recognize what it is at the moment. Now, that's not to say, in Deepa's position, that anything that says the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and it's badged on The Guardian is a good or a bad thing. It means The Guardian are simply taking money and using it well and telling their readers that this is happening. But it's the ability, and maybe Martin, I can bring you in here. I mean, in a digital era, do you know when an advert is an advert? And do you know when, a story is being paid for, and is there anything you can do about it?
Well, I mean, it's even harder than that because actually what a lot of people have discovered, and not just teenagers in Macedonia, is that news can be quite compelling and clickable, and therefore lots of advertisers will mask things as news. So-called tabloid cloakers. So remember when you'll sometimes see something on a Facebook page where you have an ad says the classic ones are where it looks as though a celebrity has died. Blah blah. And the whole idea is that get you to click the ad, and of course it doesn't go through to a news story at all. It goes through. But I think a lot of the problem here is because the very fact that we are consuming news differently, and because to come back to the previous question, there certainly historically, and it may have changed in the last 12 to 24 months, but certainly historically, some of the platforms have not had much respect for the difference between news and other material. Facebook seemed to show a degree of contempt for news when they brought in the instant articles in 2015, in the sense that they brought in a whole system which was supposed to be geared towards people publishing news directly within the platform, and it started out with just very high-end partners like the BBC and the New York Times, and then within a few months it had opened up to almost any news organization, and then within a few months after that they'd opened it up to anyone, including to sponsored advertising. So they were not distinguishing between news and sponsored advertising, so it was all looking exactly the same in your Facebook newsfeed. So the ability for the public to distinguish between what was news and what was advertising was almost deliberately blurred by the platforms themselves.
There's also tools available to news desks and newspapers where they can receive feedback from readers of the paper, and that looks like a positive thing. In other words, they're creating some kind of media community. You're consuming this product and you're becoming involved in it, and it's usually described in such a way as that maybe the paper themselves can say, we're delivering you news that you want. In other words, it's like a news desk saying, I work for the Daily Mail, and this is what a Daily Mail readership expect. I work for the New York Times. I work for the San Francisco Chronicle. And this is the community of my media, and this is what I expect. That tool can be used in such a way as that it can say, yes, I'm going to give you the news that you want. It can also deliver news that the advertisers want, the commercial influencers want. And it's that grey area, that overlap, which is maybe the difficulty of a freelancer, because if you're a freelance journalist and you're delivering, I don't know, I can ask you a question. If when you were writing commercial product, was it expected to look as if it was a news story, or was it clearly commercial? It was clearly commercial, right. Well, that's one of the good examples of it, because it's not always like that. For instance, currently the Telegraph in London has 80 staff, and they're called the Advertising / Editorial Group. They are people who work in a department that's neither editorial and neither advertising. It's just a group in the middle. And if you speak to the executives say, we absolutely clearly respect the division. We know that this is not editorial, and we will badge this as much as we can. But there's instances, for instance, there was a film on Churchill recently, the Gary Oldman film that came out, and the Telegraph ran numerous stories of Churchill and Churchill's background and the history of the time and the war of the time, all linked to the film. At the same time, the Telegraph were taking money from the production company that made the film. One of them was badged Telegraph Premium, and the other one was just normal news. Now, how do you, as a reader, make that distinction, online or not? It's very difficult. And what if, for instance, they're taking money from the production company, but it's an absolute dog of a film? Do you say that it's a terrible film and nobody should go and watch it, because that's what you would do if the film was bad? Or do you mediate? And do you say, well, it's not bad? That's what I mean is the difference. I just wanted to ask, what was the...
So did they indicate what?
One of them was called premium content, and one of them wasn't.
And
one of them was branded as and one of them wasn't. But they were doing the same thing at the same time.
And to the reader, the reader
you
couldn't
could.
distinguish unless you'd have to know that's what you were looking for.
You would have to know that that's what you were looking for. So I don't know the digital implications of that, but it's just that idea of news you want doesn't necessarily always fit. I mean, apparently there was one survey, I think this gentleman was at something I said this morning, and I quoted Ender's analysis at you. I said that the growth in digital is not even close, digital revenue is not even close to kind of making up the difference that they've actually lost. And apparently, I think online revenue going to UK publishers, not Google and Facebook, stood at 117 million in 2011 and is forecast to go to 227 million in the next 2 years. And I'm told that even that revenue is falling off. Martin, I don't know if you know that. Is there any indication that even the online revenue itself is falling off, or is that increasing? Because that's something I'm not sure of.
Well, online prices are certainly falling because the inflation of the space. I mean, that's the problem with online ads, is that there will forever be inflation. Sorry, there will forever be inflation because there's infinite space, and not infinite. There is enormous amounts of space that's growing all the time. So the price is dropping. So that's what I mean about news organisations that try and play that game. I mean, the so-called Rusbridge across. The idea that at some point digital advertising was going to cross over analog advertising, and the digital advertising was going to make up the difference. I mean, it hasn't even got close. Not even close.
Deepa, can I ask one question? At Luminate, have you experienced, do you go looking for business, or do the business come to you? Is it newspapers seeking to do something, or do you have, as an organisation, a project that you would like to do and then go and seek a client?
It's a mix of both outbound and inbound sourcing in some sense.
And has it increased any? I mean, if we're talking about a model whose revenue is decreasing, I mean, if anybody reads The Guardian, you read The Guardian, and in the middle of any news story, there's almost like, please give us money. And The Guardian, at one point losing $1 million a week, are supposed to break even because their new model, a sponsored content model, a philanthropic model, the money that they make from the Guardian websites, that's apparently all coming together, and it's all meshing into this balanced financial model. Do you find that there's new pressures on philanthropic organizations to come in and fill in this financial vacuum?
I think definitely we're seeing that, globally, whether it's Emerson Collective buying The Atlantic, or, different philanthropic actors stepping in to fill the gap in a range of different, media ecosystems.
Yeah.
On our part, we support mainly early stage media entities. And so when we invest in ad-based models, which is quite rare, they're typically quite unique in their ecosystem in terms of holding power to account. So for example, Rappler is perhaps the only voice of its kind in the Philippines. Similarly, Scroll is one of the few voices of its kind in India. Otherwise, we're searching on the for-profit, investment side for innovative business models that are replacing advertising structurally as a revenue stream in a way that can be tested and proven out. And most of those companies, I would say, are under 3 years old. So time will tell.
Okay.
I'm just really interested to hear any examples of the new models.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, a mix of things. One example is the Ken in India, which is, I think, innovating both in terms of format and in terms of, a no-ad model. Of course, it is a subscription-based model. Their format is innovative because they will send out one long-form piece of content every day. It's purely business journalism. And they're profitable within a year. And so, admittedly, they are working with an audience that has disposable income to pay for, membership because it is business-related content. But I think that's promising. It's a signal that this has worked, for a startup in an ecosystem that has, very few promising, green shoots in some sense. And so, I think we're seeing, innovative approaches in membership as well. So one of the other recent sort of fund structures that we set up was in partnership with the Membership Puzzle Project at NYU. We set up a membership and news fund to basically work with early stage media organizations and companies globally that wanted to conduct experiments in membership. And so they basically could partner with this fund for capital as well as advice from the team at MPP around, hey, I want to conduct an experiment with my audience. Let's try something out. And so we're also trying to seed these sort of new approaches to just try and see what might work for different early stage entities.
Okay. We got one question at the back here.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on the concrete cases of commercial interference you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Evening Standard, the
Yes.
Telegraph. You wrote about on your website about BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed, deleted articles, and so on.
Yeah.
Do you have other examples, maybe new examples as well, after you launched the openMedia platform? Are there new examples for this kind of interference?
The one that we looked at, the two things, if you've looked up open democracy, the ESI media that is the main one, and that was looking at London 2020 and the amount of money that they took for that, 3 million. There was another previous project, as I mentioned, Syngenta. We haven't seen anything as open and as clear as that before, and we've tried not to basically just identify something that looks like sponsored content and leave it at that. The Guardian ran a very lengthy sponsored content campaign with Airbnb. It was over about 6 months. They ran entirely positive pieces like how you can meet your next partner on Airbnb and why Airbnb is a great thing, and any almost travel features linked to Airbnb. And then the contract stopped. It was outside of its time. They were no longer being paid for that. And then the Guardian continues to write positively. And that's a that's a question that you have to ask yourself. If you get into this model and you have this partner and you've been writing positive things about them, at what point does it stop? At what point do journalists, for instance, if you're an environment journalist and you realize that your newspaper, this is not The Guardian, this is in general, that you're taking money from an organization that is paying you to write decent copy about one organization. And I spoke to a number of news editors and some senior correspondents, and they said there is a degree of self-censorship involved. You do not want to piss off a future, excuse the language, you do not want to piss off a future funder. Now that's an issue. I'm running out of time, and I wanted just to finish on this one. We've been discussing this as if this is happening now, and I want to point out that we're maybe just in a change zone. All advertising changed when television came in, and newspapers had to adapt to that. It will change again because there's new technology. If you haven't read Martin's book, I found it quite scary to read this thing because I realised there's a degree of manipulation going on that I'm not aware of. In fact, I don't really want to know about it. It's so uncomfortable. But it's worth the read. But in the 60s, an advertising guru called David Ogilvy said, there's no need for advertising to look like advertising anymore. And that was a sea change in the way that advertising was given to you. It was something you enjoyed. It was no longer just thrown at you. Well, I spoke to one of London's leading advertising executives, fairly senior, and he said to me, it's unlike Ogilvy now, but I think the public would resent knowing they're being tricked, so best not to tell them. And what that means is, when you're reading a newspaper now, almost the reflex you should have is vigilance. And that can be anything. And especially if you're dealing with commercial interference, you just need to be vigilant, and this change will happen again. But a gentleman this morning was talking about how newspapers could use mobile phones better. And he said he was doing some research, an academic, and I guaranteed him that by the time he finished his research, it would be out of date. That's how fast this thing changes. Anyway, we've run out of time and we need to let the next slot in. But can I just say thank you very much for coming and asking some questions and being here. And thanks to Martin and to Deepa. Thank you. Feels like
strange, isn't it, when you have quite a big room and not that many people, you kind of almost want to kind of sit them around the table and say, come on, have a conversation.
Have a coffee. Yeah.